team today. The presentation today, and I'll just share my screen. Where did it go? There it is. Okay. And I'll put it into slideshow. There, is that better? Can everyone see it? Very good. So it's an overview of nitrosamines. And during this presentation, what I'll be covering is what are nitrosamines, the general root cause for the presence of nitrosamines in pharmaceutical products. And then I'm going to provide an overview of the European Medicines Agency guidelines and recommendations for nitrosamines, followed by the FDA overview, and then we'll do a quick summary. So presentations should take about a half an hour, and then we'll have plenty of time for discussion. So what are nitrosamines? And as you can see as a footnote, typical regulatory people, they sort their sources. The information was taken from the FDA guidance, which I highly recommend. Any of the guidance documents that I'm noting through this presentation, please take an opportunity to read them. So nitrosamines describe a class of compounds that have a chemical structure of nitrosyl group bond to an amine. They're potential genotoxic agents and are classified as possible human carcinogens by the International Agency of the Research of Cancer. They are also part of the cohort of concern compounds as identified in ICHMs. And these compounds can form by a nitrosating reaction between amines and nitrous acid. There's a representative reaction that to form nitrosamines right here at the bottom of the page. There are 7 identified nitrosamine impurities potentially present in pharmaceutical products, and I've provided the names here in the chemical structures for folks for a reference. So what are the general root causes? This kind of, we know nitrosamines are in smoked meats and those types of products. This kind of came out of the blue. All of a sudden, there was this big concern in 2019, there's nitrosamines in products, and oh my gosh, what are we going to do about it? So there's, as you can see here, and this is not an all-comprehensive list, but it gives you an idea that they're coming from a variety of sources. So therefore, the industry need to, when we're doing our risk assessments, have to evaluate this from a very three-dimensional perspective. So for instance, for API, the use of sodium nitrite or other nitrosating agents in the presence of a secondary or tertiary amines or quaternary ammonium salts, or in combination with reagents, solvents, or catalysts, which are susceptible to degradation to secondary or tertiary amines. That's a lot of chemistry right there. And I had to dust off my chemistry book when I first started looking at this. I would highly, recommend people do a lot of Googling here. This is very, very interesting, a lot of chemistry here. The use of nitrosamine contaminated starting materials. So this is where we need to start digging in with our API suppliers, understanding, what are their chemical synthesis? Is there an opportunity for a nitrosamine to form that's outside of where we would expect it to, given the opportunities as outlined in the top box there. This is also around degradation processes of the starting materials, intermediates, or drug substance, including those induced by inherent reactivity in combination with the carryover of sodium nitrite into the next step, or other nitrosating agents. So this is really where we need to understand the control the process and how this is, and the control the process of your APIs. It can also be coming from recovered solvents, catalysts, reagents, due to the presence of these residual amines. So they're reacting and they're causing this nitrosamine. And if the recovery process involves a quelching step, nitrosamines could actually form during that solvent recovery as well. As we move on to drug product, contamination from blister packs. This is coming from everywhere. Storage conditions after packaging, if there's residual amines, is this something that the storage conditions, there's a reaction going on with your product during the storage conditions that's causing this nitrosamine to form in the products? Excipients, we're even down to excipients. Nitrates are common nitrosating impurities in excipients that may lead to nitrosamine impurity formation in the process, or actually during the shelf life as well. And then we're back to the degradation pathways. Now, this is what I'm talking about, the three-dimensional risk assessment. It could be coming from across contamination due to different processes run in the manufacturing facilities, or on the same line due to operator-related errors, such as inadequate phase separation or contaminated solvents or even process equipment. It could be coming from the use of contaminated raw or recovered materials, as we talked about, even on the API. It's a bit of redundant here. It also could be related to the water quality as well. So this is something that needs to be evaluated. And then, back to the other one that we sort of touched on earlier, lack of process optimization and control, really knowing and understanding your process and where these chemical reactions could be happening and causing nitrosamine to form. A lot of information here again, and guess what? This isn't exhaustive. There's a lot more. So I highly recommend you look at the FDA and EMA guidelines for the full listings. So now we're going to transition over to the EMA overview, and I hope that the information I've provided here kind of helps set us up for what some of the recommendations are that the agency is asking for. And I somehow managed to put the little the little scribble notes, so apologies, I didn't mean to do that. So in this EMA overview, we're going to look at the EMA journey and the key milestones that have happened to date. I'm also going to digest the CHMP scientific opinion and the key recommendations around this, and then the relevant guidelines and impact to the authorized products, as well as those products that are currently going to be going through or are going through a marketing authorization approval, and then any recent developments. So the key milestones. So in September 26, 2019, the first EU recommendations came out to complete step 1 of risk evaluation. And this is what the scientific guides are telling us. There's nitrosamines in the product. We need the companies to do an assessment of not only the API, but also the drug product. And these, at that time in September of 2019, these evaluations needed to be provided for chemically synthesized products by the 26th of March. On February 20th, 2020, the EMA and industry had a scientific workshop, only scientific dialogue against of the Article 5.3 closing CHMP scientific opinion. And what this is the scientific opinion that came out in June, July, that I'm going to review. EMA said to CHMP, you need to provide a scientific opinion on this to give guidance to the industry and to digest it. It is a fabulously written document, and we'll go through it a little bit today. March 25th, 2020, EU step 1, they extended this step 1 due to the coronavirus pandemic. Companies, industry had pushed back on agencies saying, given the fact that we're in the pandemic, we do not have the resources to be able to do these risk assessments. And these were then extended out. So, and it was extended to October 1st. At that time, we thought we might be able to get those done by then. And then as of July 9th, 2020, the CHMP scientific opinion, Article 5.3, was issued. And then pharmaceutical step 1 for the risk assessment was extended to the 31st of March, 2021. And when this new extension came, biologics were then put into scope as well. Previously, it was only chemically synthesized products. And at this point as well, they also formed the NIOG, which is the Nitrosamines Implementation Oversight Group, and it's made up of EMA, CHMP, CMDH, and EDQM. This is the website down here that is a nitrosamine website for EMA. I provided the link. Tremendous amount of resources and information there. Highly recommend taking a look at it. So when I took a look at this scientific opinion that was issued by EMA, one, it gives a phenomenal background on the history of the nitrosamines and how this formed. So it really gives you a great grounding on it. But it also, the recommendations to me fell into 3 different categories. The first 2, EMA defines the limits by ICH M7 and the calculated lifetime daily exposure. Previously, this was calculated slightly differently, but they are now asking for the exposure to be toward lifetime daily exposure, and we'll go through that as part of the recommendations. As we go through, and this is kind of setting the scene for, this is what's expected in your products. As we look at recommendations 3 through 8, this is if you've detected it in your product, how to control it and what the expectations are. So this is really the key parts of the recommendation. And then 9 through 11 is really the control strategy. What analytical method considerations the industry needs to be taking a look at, and also epidemiological studies as to what is the overall impact, the long-term impact of nitrosamines in these products. A lot of information here. And I'm not going to read everything, by the way. We're going to touch on each one of these, and the items highlighted in green text are just key points that to really distinguish. There's a lot of text on the slides. So the presence of nitrosamines in human medicinal products shall be mitigated as much as possible and shall be below the limit as outlined in ICH M7 of the cohort of concerns as defined in the guideline and calculated by the lifetime daily exposure. So even if it's a product that's used not for a lifetime, the expectation is the calculation is done to lifetime daily exposure. The risks of the presence of nitrosamines must be evaluated by the marketing authorization and the applicants. And if there is a risk, confirmatory testing must be completed as published in the Q&A document. This not only applies to existing marketing authorizations, it also applies to new MAAs at the time of submission. So the expectation is that you would have this assessment done when you're submitting a new marketing authorization after this guidance was put in place July 2020. Authorized products containing chemically synthesized APIs as well as biological medicinal products. The assessment must cover, and this is where we were looking at where nitrosamines are coming from. So the assessment must cover not only drug substance or API, it needs to cover finished product, and you need to consider the root causes, and any confirmatory testing on the finished product should be identified. Biological medicinal products, whilst it is recognized it's not a huge risk that these could be contaminated with nitrosamines, nonetheless, we still need to do an assessment of them to ensure. So especially there's risk factors that need to be taken into consideration for biological products that contain chemically synthesized fragments, where risk factors similar to chemical synthesized active substance are present, and biologics using processes where nitrosating agents are deliberately added or those are in their packaging, such as blister packs, which is contains nitrocellulose. As we move on to recommendation 3, so now we've set the stage. If you have it, this is what's expected of you, and this is kind of the how. Where nitrosamines have been detected, a limit based on the above mentioned M7 principles of cohort of concern for lifetime daily exposure should be calculated. And limits are provided in this guideline on 7 specific nitrosamines on nanograms per day. The omission of a specification can only be justified if the levels of each identified nitrosamine is less than or equal to 10% of the defined limit, and less than lifetime approach is not recommended by the CHMP. This was previously acceptable, it is not now, due to the potential risk of exceeding the individual DNA repair capacity with the exposure of high acute nitrosamines. If more than one nitrosamine is identified in any given product or in the API, it must be ensured that the total risk level of the sum of all detected nitrosamines does not exceed 1 in 100,000 lifetime risk. So you have to apply this as it looks across not just one, but any nitrosamine that would be present in your product. There are alternative approaches that the agency will evaluate and work with the company on, and does not exceed the limit of the most potent nitrosamine identified may also be used. Now, As we know, there's not a one size fits all for our pharmaceutical products. So we have some exceptions to what is required for recommendation 3 and 4. So number 5, investigation report and benefit risk evaluation must be submitted to competent authorities for products where a single nitrosamine cannot be kept below the limit as defined in recommendation 3. Or the total risk of the sum of more than one detected nitrosamine cannot be kept below the 1 in 100,000 risk. This is where we've got a medicinal product that's on the market. We've identified that we've got some nitrosamine contamination in it. However, if there is a medically necessary need for the product to be on the market, they will evaluate these on a case-by-case basis until the recommendations in 3 and 4 can be met. We do not want to be taking products away from patients that they absolutely need, but they do want to ensure that this guideline is followed through on, but we can't just stop production and stop distribution on some of these products. If the product falls outside the scope of M7, such as a product used for advanced cancer, these products do not need to have the nitrosamine guidelines applied to them. And then we move on to number 7, when nitrosamines are identified with sufficient substance-specific animal carcinogenicity data to calculate a reliable TD50, then it should be used to derive a substance-specific limit for the lifetime exposure as recommended in M7. And then when nitrosamines are identified with insufficient substance-specific data to drive a substance-specific limit, what they're saying is this is a specific TDC for nitrosamines of 18 nanograms per day can be used as a default option. Again, these things need to be discussed with EMA, but again, they're outlining options that companies can avail of. And then as we look at our last 3 recommendations, I recognize this is a lot of information, folks. MAH should implement a control strategy with regards to nitrosamines for their active substance as well as their finished products, and should include current and prospective measures to minimize the risk of generation and or contamination. So these risk assessments need to be done not only for active substance as well as finished products. And as the marketing authorization holder, it is our responsibility, if we are taking supply in from other companies, that we get the adequate amount of information to be able to complete those risk assessments. Ensure that the products are controlled in accordance, manufactured and controlled in accordance to the relevant guidelines within Europe, as outlined here, and that ensure that active substance and excipients used in the manufacture comply with good manufacturing practices. This is laid down in Article 46 in Directive as outlined here. This will be checked. The agency on inspection will ensure that you have the appropriate control over your products. When I attended the EMA workshop in November, there was some pushback from some of the marketing authorizations holders saying, we can't get a lot of information from API suppliers, especially if they hold a CEP or have an ASMF. And EMA, as well as EDQM, said, well, it's your responsibility. And there's an additional guideline that we'll look at as part of this information that does outline there's some actions that our agency is helping industry to get more information from these API suppliers so that these assessments can be done. It is the marketing authorization holders' responsibility. Sorry, I've gone down a rabbit hole. So the specific requirements for analytical methods employed to test nitrosamines. This is a really great section of the dossier. I highly recommend that you read it. But it references back to the limits stated back in recommendation 3 for the limit of quantitation. It's very important that higher sensitivity of analytical methods may be needed for medicinal products with higher daily doses, ensuring that the methods that are utilized are, if you're going to be looking at one nitrosamine, or if you're looking at multiple nitrosamines, how does this test check all of these? And you have to get these methods also, obviously endorsed by the agency. The last part, and this is a little bit kind of outside of my wheelhouse, but nonetheless quite interesting, is the determination of the relationship between nitrosamine exposure from the medicinal product and that risk of cancer. So this interesting part of the guidance document, or the opinion, I should say, is that the use of epidemiological studies are challenging due to the study design. And it talks about this in length, and I find it quite interesting. What they're saying is that it might be more appropriate to use things like nationwide registries, large healthcare databases, to be able to ascertain this relationship between exposure and the risk of cancer. There's also the opportunity to use meta-analytic approach in case of insufficient patient numbers in a given particular data source. And PRAC and CHMP suggest that potential objectives for such study would need to be referred to as confirm the risk or quantify the risk due to the existing circumstances and uncertainties. So again, there's a lot of information there to unpack. I hope I've been able to sort of digest this and get you interested in reading that opinion as well. Oh, and the link is right here. Relevant guidance. So in association with this, there's a questions and answers and the CMDH practical guide for additional specific information related to the nationally authorized products, including MRP and DCP. Highly recommend that you read it. As we've outlined here, there's a three-step process here with Europe. Step one is risk evaluation outcome, and these are due for chemically synthesized products as well as biologics, and this also includes vaccines. The APIs are due on the 31st of March this year, and biologics and vaccines are due on the 1st of July. So where there's been a risk identified, then you proceed to step two, which is confirmatory testing, and then step three, which is any subsequent variations that may need to be made to your process or your testing to either better control your process to ensure that these nitrosamines are not being formed as part of your process, not coming in on your raw materials, and that you also got some confirmatory testing to ensure that as your product is being released to the market, that it is below the levels that are recommended by ICH M7 and this guideline. If you have to move to step 2 and 3, for chemically synthesized products, step 2 and step 3 need to be completed by the 26th of September, 2022. And for biologic products and vaccine products, these need to be completed by the 1st of July, 2023. The recent developments, as of October of last year, EMA and national competent authorities are asking marketing authorization holders that contain metformin-containing medicines that they're testing them before they go onto the market. This communication is provided here for your reference. On the 27th of October, EMA released implementation plan for the lessons learned for the presence of nitrosamine. This is the document that I was referring to. And this was related to the lessons learned for the sartan medicines. This includes 40 recommendations for assigned parties within the agency, and that's across CHMP, EDQM, on how we can better, what did we learn from the sartan medicine nitrosamine contamination, and what can we do better? And one of those that I had alluded to was around getting more information from API suppliers, and that's very succinctly called out. And what I found really interesting here is that all actions were not weighted equal, and there's defined timelines, which is very exciting, organized, and tidy, which very much appeals to my OCD nature, but also ensures that we within industry as well as agency that we're going to be seeing these lessons learned and implementation of things to make this better. Some of them are short term, which will happen in less than a year. Some of them are medium term, which they need to be completed with 1 to 3 years, and some are longer, and it's a 3 to 5 year. So I was very impressed by this document. Again, highly recommend a read on this one as well. And then November 13th, EMA aligned recommendations for sartans with those of other medicines as well. So, any questions before we move on to the FDA? This FDA is very similar, but I'm happy to take a few questions because I know I've been yakking away for a little while now. If not, I'll continue. Okay. So this is a summary of the FDA guidance. And again, a lot of similarities between the two agencies, which gives me a lot of reassurance. But it discusses the potential root causes in the formation and advises, again, that API and drug product manufacturers need to conduct a risk assessment of their approved products, as well as those that are pending application. And that we need to take the appropriate actions to reduce or prevent the presence of nitrosamines in both API as well as drug product. These recommendations made in this guidance apply to all chemically synthesized APIs. They also apply to drug products containing chemically synthesized APIs and drug products at risk due to other factors as described in the guidance, which I will go through here. You can read it and understand what those are. This guidance, also described by the agency, is also the current thinking on the topic and should be viewed as recommendations unless it's specifically called out that its statutory requirements is cited. So approved products. So the risk assessment to be conducted both on API as well as drug product needs to be completed within 6 months. And so those assessments need to be in by May 2021. If the risk is identified, similar as we looked at the EMA, so this first one is step 1. The next one is step 2, 3. As you would relate to the FDA and EMA together, you will need to complete confirmatory testing and any required changes to the application. As we talked about, that could be changes to raw materials, they could be changes to the process as well as additional testing. That needs to be completed within 3 years of the guidance. So that needs to be in by November of 2023. Pending application. So if you're in a pre-submission meeting, if you're about to submit, you need to conduct a risk assessment and submit it during the application, including any updates to the DMFs. If you're currently under review, the recommendation is to get that risk assessment done ASAP and notify FDA if there's any levels above the IA and amend the application as appropriate during the review process. So AI stands for acceptable intake limits for nitrosamines. Aligned with AI, so the acceptable intake, they are EMA and FDA are aligned as in their guidance with the acceptable levels, our lifetime daily exposure, as we saw in the EMA guideline. And the tables pretty much match up. The limits apply if DP contains a single nitrosamine. So if there's more than one present and the total quantity exceeds 26.5 nanograms per day based on the maximum daily dose, you need to discuss it with the agency. For drug products with an MDD of less than 880 milligrams per day, a recommended limit for total nitrosamines of 0.03 ppm is not more than 26.5 nanograms per day is considered acceptable. And for those with an MDD of 800, and with its maximum daily dose, by the way, sorry, 880 milligrams per day, the limit of the total nitrosamine should be adjusted so as not to exceed the recommended limit of 26.5 nanograms per day. Very specific guidelines on what's expected. So the recommendations for API: mitigate presence of the nitrosamine impurity via process design optimization during routine synthesis and factors to be considered during process development. Here's some which wasn't necessarily present in the EMA guideline, very specific recommendations here of how you can do this. Consider removing coaching steps. You need to audit your supplier and monitor the at-risk materials. And where appropriate, you need to establish controls and additional specifications for those at-risk materials. Recommendations on the use of recovered materials to avoid cross-contamination. Basically what FDA is saying, we know, and as we saw earlier in the presentation, nitrosamines could be coming from some of these recovered materials in your reagents, your catalysts, and your solvents. They're saying don't use them because you may be adding additional risk for cross-contamination. And then look at your water quality. Are there any risks, the risk of low levels of nitrosamine in the water from the environment that's then contaminating your product? And that's another one of the things that we looked at our table earlier on in the presentation. And then again, the use of reprocessed and reworked APIs to nitrosamine ensure that you will be able to reprocess and rework your API to get those nitrosamine levels down. So I think they're giving you that opportunity. But again, this isn't something you can just implement based on this guideline. As they've outlined, you will need to provide the appropriate variation or submissions to the agencies to change your processes to allow for these reprocessing and reworkings to happen if they're not already currently covered under your application. The control of nitrosamine impurities, if detected above the limit of quantitation. Control strategy needs to include a specification to ensure that the nitrosamine level is below the acceptable intake. Any API batch found to contain levels of nitrosamine impurities above the recommended acceptable limit should not be released without prior agreement. Again, very similar to what we saw in the EMA. If you have a product that you've identified nitrosamine and you're above your limit, you need to have a conversation with them around how do we get these down, but we also need to get these important medicines to patients as well. Recommendations is part of this guideline for drug product assessment. It needs to be conducted in conjunction with the API manufacturers. They're linking it all up. This is fantastic. And again, back to one of the issues that's noted as I keep ringing that bell. You need to be able to get back in and discuss these things with your API manufacturers. You need access to those data. Degradation pathways need to be considered in the risk assessment during the manufacture, as well as all the way through the storage and the shelf life. It's not just one, during that processing, you got to look at the full gamut of drug product. And if nitrosamine risks are identified, confirmatory testing to be completed using the appropriately validated and sensitive methods to pick up this nitrosamine or multiple nitrosamines. If you're going to use one method or two methods, your method needs to be sensitive enough as well as validated. The control of drug product, all incoming components to be tested, including at-risk API, until verification is obtained. The material consistently demonstrates the acceptable levels of nitrosamines. This is no different than what we've been doing all along. You need to qualify your vendors, but there's a particular focus here on nitrosamines as well. You need to have a control strategy that should evaluate the nitrosamine presence during manufacture from API, or could be formed during the final drug product. And again, they're back to the shelf life as well. If you have identified a nitrosamine and it's above the limit of quantitation, control strategy needs to be put in place to ensure that this remains within the appropriate limits. And it should include a specification limit as well. Again, this is something that you can't just implement. Again, we'll have to go through the appropriate review process with an application. And then given the uncertainties regarding nitrosamines and their presence in drugs, testing of each batch on release should be conducted. So this is a little bit different from EMA, whilst they are requiring this for metformin products. FDA is looking for this testing to be done across the board. So a summary. So for EU and US, we've gone through those. Other agencies such as UK and Turkey have aligned with EU and with the revised timeline as well as scope. Switzerland issued a guidance in November and extended their deadline to March, but you only need to submit if you have identified a nitrosamine. If you haven't, you don't need to submit. And then as we discussed here, and we didn't necessarily get into it too much, but with the presence of these nitrosamines a guideline review and update of ICH M7 is definitely swiftly needs to be initiated to help address this additional information with regards to nitrosamines. And that is it. So thank you for your time. I covered a lot of information there.
Thank you very much, Meg. And thank you for sharing your time and this morning with us. Just want to ask everyone, if you want to post questions, please do so on the chat, or please feel free to unmute and ask your question. I've got 3 questions for you to start, Meg. Okay, so this is from Alphonsus. He said that based on your experience in the EU, when the product contained nitrosamines impurities, what would EMA expectation? And should nitrosamine impurities controlled in DS or DP specs?
Well, I think it depends on where the so what is the expectation? So the first part of the question is, what is the expectation of EMA if you've identified nitrosamine? Is that correct?
I believe so, yes.
Okay, yeah, so I mean, their expectation is, so, and as we outlined, there's this, a step process. If you've identified these nitrosamines in your product, and I'll give this a caveat, Alphonsus, is that if it is above the recommended limits, then you need to contact the agency immediately to have the discussion with them about how you're going to, best handle this product on the market. If you're outside the recommendations 3 and 4. So the expectation from EMA is if you have identified and you are above these intake limits, the expectation of EMA is that you contact them immediately to have a discussion of how you're going to handle this until you can get these levels down to a acceptable limit. And again, if your product is, again, within one of the exceptions, if it's for cancer or ICH 7 doesn't apply, then again, I think my understanding is that you would communicate that to EMA through your risk assessment that it's due in March. If your nitrosamines have been identified, you need to provide your risk assessment as of March 31st. And then for API or for small molecule products, you have until 2022 to do any appropriate testing, implement testing, as well as any changes to your process until 2022. If it's a bio, it's 2023. I hope I've answered that question. I think there was a second part too, Linda.
The second part was, should nitrosamine impurities controlled in DS or DP specs?
To be honest, I would say if it is in your drug, if it's coming in your API, you need to ensure that it's within the appropriate limits within as an incoming raw material. And if it's not going to be removed as part of your drug product process, that you would do it as part of your drug product. So if we look back at the FDA and EMA, it's the appropriate control strategy around your API coming in. And then if you're seeing nitrosamines, potentially being formed in your drug product based on your risk assessment, then the testing would probably have to be at the drug product as well. But again, I think I would be guided by your risk assessment and where you need to exert and provide more control based on where you're seeing the nitrosamines coming into your product. I hope I answered that okay.
Okay, thank you. And a related question, have you experienced with the agencies in the region, such as Korea MFDS and Singapore HSA? Go on.
Those are outside of my current remit. I know my MSD colleague is on the line, and I don't if they wanted to field that question with regards to those regions, or maybe that can be a follow-up.
Yeah, or because they are also asking, are there expectations similar to EMA and US FDA?
So, and I think this is a great opportunity. So my MSD colleague who works in our Singapore office and takes care of our Asia Pac region I'm not sure he was able to join today, but he's kindly offered to provide a follow-up on the legislation and any expectations in the Asia Pacific region for nitrosamines.
Yeah, hi Meg, I'm there. I've joined today's meeting, so maybe I think, yeah, so maybe in the next meeting I would be able to give the insight into the APAC requirements. Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much.
Okay, thank you. Or maybe perhaps we can get a follow-up answer and circulate that. Next question is from Stefan to you. Is there any analytical method available for testing nitrosamines in biologics?
That's a great question. I could follow up with you. Not off the shelf, I don't believe, but I know companies are developing tests to test nitrosamines in biologic products, but I can follow up with that question and get an answer for you.
Thank you. Any other questions? That's all I have that can see that are posted. Does anyone have any other questions? Or feel free to unmute if you want to ask rather than type away on the chat. Okay, so yeah, I think if there are no other questions, want to thank Meg very much for your time today. We're ending like 15 minutes early, so we just give people one last chance if anyone wants to get a question in before we end. And so how are things with you over there? Is everything, you know?
Oh, not great, to be honest. I mean,